Good afternoon. My name is Joe Fungi, and I work here on campus in the Office of Research. Specifically have the position as a Director of Technology Transfer, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means as I go through my presentation today. I also currently hold the position of President at our local incubator here in Missoula called Montech, and so I'll make a few comments about that as I talk as well. First, just sort of big picture research. Why does it matter for Montana, for our campus? I always think of sort of 5 key points. The first thing is that of the $60 to $70 million in research that UM does per year, first thing that directly contributes to is jobs here in our local economy. So basically 60 to 70% of the funds that come to U of M, most of it federal dollars, go directly towards someone's salary. It could be a research faculty professor, could be administrative support, could be lab technicians, anything of that nature. So there's a direct economic benefit for our community and for our state to have a research intensive institution here in Missoula. The second thing is that it creates a lot of opportunities for students. And particularly that often applies in the sciences, and so graduate students are typically funded under research projects. And so of that 60 to 70 million, you might see that somewhere in the order of 200 student assistantships are funded, and that provides opportunities for students to engage in hands-on experiences in the lab. Basically become trained as sort of our next generation of scientists, engineers, and things of that nature. The third key contributor of research to our community is in the terms of creation of what we would call intellectual property. Most people think of this as maybe patents, but it could be other things, copyrights and whatnot. And basically the way that happens is the federal government is still the primary funder of early stage research. In general sense, most large corporations aren't funding, sort of black box creativity houses within their organization. And so most people still feel that the federal government and specifically our research institutions are responsible for sort of developing new discoveries. And so when you think about everything ranging from treatment of disease to a better understanding of our environment, to education advances. Most of these things are developed in the context of a university setting where people are looking at sort of early stage research concepts. And so out of these early stage research concepts comes new ideas. It could be new ideas for treating stroke, could be new ideas for educational platforms of better ways to integrate techniques for maybe students with disabilities. And so those types of things can oftentimes create new intellectual property. And so it's a direct correlation between intellectual property developed through research that's conducted on our campus and campuses around the country. That's a third contributor. The fourth is in terms of new companies. And so basically building on the point that I just made about early stage research, if you think about this from an investment perspective, it's oftentimes difficult to go out and find large corporations that are willing to invest their hard-earned dollars into early stage technology. Oftentimes with early stage research derived technology, there's even questions of what markets might be applicable and things of that nature. And so basically you end up with a scenario where you have early stage technology, you have corporations looking for profit, and you sort of have this middle ground, which oftentimes might be referred to sort of the valley of death, where there's some technical aspect or business aspect that isn't quite developed enough to find corporate partners. And so in that sense, it creates an opportunity for new companies sometimes to be formed. And I'll give an example of that in a second. The fifth key contributor to research being a part of our institution and our community is new products. And this is sort of the genesis of my office here on campus and offices like mine around the country. And it dates back to 1980, what was called the Federal Bayh-Dole legislation. And basically this was derived from a fundamental question by the taxpayers, which is what is the return on my investment to research, since most of our awards are funded through National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, so forth and so on. And so asking that question, there was some legislation that was put in place which essentially allowed universities to have the first right of ownership to technology that was developed through the research. And so basically the whole genesis of that was to develop new products, which would be a direct response to the taxpayers' question of what their return might be off of investment in research. And so there are numerous examples around the world of pharmaceuticals and other things that were developed in a university context. Even here in Missoula, we have a few products that are on the market that are a direct result of research here on our campus. It's a small company called Sunburst Sensors, which produces oceanographic pH meters, basically. So it's what you would think of as using in a Chem 101 lab as a pH meter, but they can throw it off the side of a boat. And so those instruments are manufactured here in Missoula, and basically were developed through research funded here. Another example is a small company called Purity Systems. They produce a resin product, and this helps with the recovery of heavy metals. And so in that context, they've been able to find application in the mining industry, and they've actually been able to sell some product into China in their mining operations there. So these are examples of products that have come out of research. So just sort of a quick recap, sort of 5 reasons in my mind that we want to engage in research and the benefits that it provides. First, it provides jobs, direct jobs in our economy. Second, it provides opportunity for students. Third, it produces new intellectual property. Fourth, it produces new companies. And fifth, it creates new products that can improve the quality of life for not only those in our country, but people around the world. So that's sort of the broad context of technology transfer and what I do. The second thing I'll comment on is just sort of an example of how that comes to fruition, and sort of a success story that we're currently in the midst of here in Missoula. And as many of you may have heard, the example is Rivertop Renewables. And just to sort of build on those 5 points I just talked about, I'll sort of tell their story quickly. It began with a research faculty professor, Don Kiley, who spent his career building up research in the area of carbohydrate chemistry, and specifically with an interest in renewable chemicals. And so basically, Don, over a 25-year career, received numerous grants from various funding agencies, USDA among them, that basically funded his research into an area of renewable chemicals that 25 years ago wasn't really the talking point that it is today. And so basically the first contributor was, Don was able to employ folks in his lab through those grants that he was awarded. In addition, he was able to provide numerous opportunities for students to advance their education, and basically develop opportunities for furtherance of their education in the field of chemistry, which was his area of expertise. So that's the student opportunities. Third was intellectual property. Amidst all this research and student involvement, there were some new processes that were developed, and it specifically relates to a compound called glucaric acid. And so glucaric acid has the properties to replace phosphates, particularly in household detergents, road salts, and things of that nature. And so through the course of Don's career, he developed some intellectual property. And so that intellectual property involved the process of producing glucaric acid in an economical manner. And so that intellectual property was patented by the university. And today that represents almost as much as 20 to 30 patents in countries around the world. The fourth thing was that 4 years ago, Don Kiley decided that a company was the best mechanism to move his research into the real world. And so upon retirement, he formed Rivertop Renewables with his son and a few of his graduate students. And so just to shorten the story, 4 years later, that company represents more than 20 employees. They've raised millions of dollars in investment capital, and many of their employees are graduates of MUS, and more particularly, many of their employees are making 2 to 3 times the average wage of a Montanan. And so this small company that was basically formed out of research discoveries here has now led to significant impact in terms of jobs and company creation in our community. And so to bring it full circle to the fifth point is a product. And so this winter, as you're driving around Montana and you hit some icy roads, hopefully the State Department will have some salt that they'll be putting out on the roads. And so for the second year in a row, Rivertop will actually be responsible for producing the road salt that is distributed around the state of Montana. So this is, as I said, the second year that they've won this contract, and they're starting to branch out into other states as well. And so this is just full circle as to how, in one guy's mind, Don Kiley, some research began many years ago, and along the way educated lots of students, created some patents, a company, and is now the result of a product that we are finding utility for here in our community. Just to the bigger picture for Rivertop, they ultimately see their target market to be detergents, and specifically when you look at replacements of phosphates, oftentimes there's sort of a glazing of the dishes that you might see, and so the efforts to replace that with citrates and things of that nature hasn't been as successful. And so their product is showing utility that basically you can end up with the same clean glass look that you would with phosphates, but with a renewable chemical. And so they're currently exploring and beginning to advance partnerships with large-scale manufacturers of detergents for placement of their product, glucaric acid, into many household items that we all use today. So with that sort of, I guess, big picture concept, I'll sort of take the last bit of my time to talk a little bit about, I guess, some sort of practical advice. I mean, what should you do? It might sound a little bit daunting to think about, here's a company, so why would I even think about visiting with Joe or anyone in the research office about this? And so I think that to take it down to a practical level, I'll talk about a few things. And the first is that, basically if you have any idea, when I say idea, concept, a new invention, a new process that you're utilizing, and you feel that there might be some need for broad dissemination or distribution, even if it doesn't necessarily seem like it might make millions of dollars, that's sort of what the office is set up to do. And so we help in all stages of intellectual property protection and advancement. And so basically our process is pretty simple. If Brent Ruby comes forward today with an idea, we work to capture that in a written form, as we have some reporting requirements that go back to the federal government if there's federal funding. And basically that process then gives us something tangible to work with. We'll typically then do some sort of an assessment to determine what mechanism this idea or invention might move forward under. And so that doesn't necessarily always mean that it has to be patented or copyrighted. There are numerous examples where the best mechanism of transfer is to just simply publish and present results and data. And that's still a strong part of our charge as a research institution. But beyond that, we can then, in any form, we're charged to work with outside intellectual property counsel to help protect these rights that are essentially granted to the university via the faculty's efforts as an employee. In the exchange for the faculty essentially granting those rights is governed under the faculty collective bargaining agreement and the Regents policy. And basically what it says is that in exchange for the university owning and managing your idea, the inventor receives roughly 50% as personal income from any future revenues that come in off of that invention or idea. And then of the remaining 50%, there's a sort of a tiered formula, but in essence, basically 2/3 goes back to further research efforts of that person in their college or department. And then the very last 1/3 of that second 50%, which is 1/6 of the income, is retained in the Office of Research just to help advance further intellectual property that might be developed. So the university helps to protect intellectual property. Then we also take it one step further in terms of helping to move that forward in terms of to a business entity or someone that might be able to commercialize, let's say. And so basically that's in the form of a business agreement called a license agreement typically. And so these license agreements basically are between the university and some external entity. It can also be in collaboration with other universities. And basically that exchange allows the contracting organization to maybe sell a product or utilize a resource in exchange for some compensation. And that could be in the form of royalty arrangements or other monetary return mechanisms. And then finally, we manage that entire process in terms of what returns we have that come back. We manage the distribution of those funds according to the formula that I described. So the basic take-home, is if you have an idea, there's process in place for us to help you advance and maybe understand the options for how to move that forward. And so we have a pretty casual approach in our office, and so feel free to at any time send me an email or give me a phone call, and I'd be happy to visit with you. And just to give an example, since we're in the College of Education, of something that's not technical in nature, that was a technology transfer story that we assisted with. It had to do with some curriculum that was developed for K through 12 with regard to Native American studies. And so this was developed through the department or through the College of Continuing Education a few years ago. And basically it was the only one of its kind in the country. And so I didn't know at the time that basically it's very difficult for K through 12 teachers to find access to resources which they can use to educate their students on Native Americans, which is obviously a very important aspect of our culture and history here in Montana. And so basically these materials were brought forward, and there was some copyrights that had been put in place, and we essentially ended up with 4 or 5 other state agencies. For example, the state of Washington was one of those, and we contracted with basically the equivalent of their OPI so that their teachers could have access to these materials in an online format. There were other organizations that were looking at, or more interested in more of a paper distribution. And so basically in that example, the university did not make tens of millions of dollars off of these deals, but it was a mechanism that if the information had simply just been put on the web and in hopes for dissemination, it probably wouldn't have been there. But the office was able to help facilitate not only to make sure the protection was in place, but then to negotiate these agreements with these other state institutions so that these materials could be disseminated. And so I just use it as an example that we can help for the most technical invention or idea you may come forward with, and then we can also help on things that people might perceive to be less technical, but just as important in a broader context. The other aspect, so that's one aspect of a reason you might want to come talk with someone in the office if you have an idea. Second thing, or second reason you might want to come talk with us is maybe if you have some contractual issues, particularly if that deals with someone that's sort of in the private sector. So another area that we have expertise in is what partnerships should look like between the university and private corporations. And so basically, as an example of that, if you could think about research contracts. Oftentimes in research contracts, it's pages and pages of legalese, which is pretty standard procedure. But then oftentimes there's a little blurb that has to do with intellectual property. And so depending upon the funding agency or the company that might be involved, they have different requirements for what they would like to see that language look like. And so sometimes that language may say that the company wants to own everything that's developed underneath that contract. And there are definitely cases where that is a circumstance that we would grant. There are other cases where we may interpret that the university or the faculty member, students may be more of the creative process. And in that sense, we might want to have some sort of a joint ownership of intellectual property. And so anyway, those types of questions, negotiations, are something that the Technology Transfer Office is well suited to be engaged with. We work closely with the Office of Sponsored Programs to make sure that all aspects of that language have been properly negotiated. But it's an open door invitation for any time that you have questions about what that language might need to look like in your circumstances. And one of the, I guess, the pieces of counsel to apply there is the fact that one of the things we always need to make sure that we protect under contracts is the right for the university to use whatever's developed for educational and research purposes. And so there may be opportunities where an organization funds something here at the university and they want to own what's developed, and that may be acceptable to you and to I, but at the same time we wouldn't want you to be 2 or 3 years down the road and need to use an assessment that was developed and that be owned by someone else and us have to go back in and negotiate just for the aspect of research and education. So we always need to make sure that we protect that right when we have these types of negotiations. Beyond that, it gets a little bit more technical, but we have the responsibility to negotiate the transfer of materials between institutions or companies. So we call those sort of material transfer agreements. And so this is often applicable in the biological sciences where you have different cell lines or different mice that might need to be exchanged between two entities or faculty collaborators. And in that case, we make sure that it's well defined as to who owns what intellectual property up front, as to do our best to eliminate confusion and whatnot down the road. And then the other aspect of that is confidentiality agreements. And this is something that I don't think is necessary most of the time for introductory calls with other people. But I do think it's worth mentioning that when we have conversations with non-UM affiliates, whether it's another university or a company, we need to be somewhat, I think, cautious in the early stages as to how open we are to sharing our ideas, particularly if there might be some intellectual property merit to those ideas. And so in that case, we can always advise as to what you might say or how you might say something in advance. If discussions get to a point of developing where you need to have some formal legal mechanism of protection, we can negotiate a confidentiality agreement and to be put in place there as well. And so basically any aspect of negotiation or engagement with industry or with other institutions that might constitute the need for partnership or intellectual property protection is another aspect that we can be of assistance with. The third sort of practical, I guess, application that I'll talk about is just, in broadest context, entrepreneurship. And if you or someone you know may have any opportunity or ideas about how you might be personally involved in some sort of a new company or even an idea of forming a company to advance something that you've worked very hard on throughout the course of your career. I gave the example of Rivertop earlier, and there are numerous other examples of how we might partner to develop a new company. But again, it also companies can also serve for other purposes as well. There's funding out there called SBIR type funding. There's been examples in the Rural Institute where faculty members have had a company but still maintain their employment at the university and been able to leverage these SBIR type funds, which are federal funds aimed at sort of commercialization. And in this specific case, the faculty was able to advance what you would call some sort of guidelines for nutritional assessment, which has application in group homes. And so sometimes it might be a mechanism for us to consider either access to research dollars or advancing sort of research in collaboration with the university. So that can be one mechanism of a company. Rivertop's an example of raising lots of investment capital and creating lots of jobs. And then there's sort of a whole middle spectrum as to what you might want to do or have ideas. And so my encouragement is to bring that forward. We have in place a few mechanisms to help in that thought process. And I'll just sort of run through those quickly. The first is that there's sort of an entry-level advisory board that's been assembled. These are, for the most part, non-UM business-minded type people that have experience in a wide variety of applications, from finance to management and whatnot. And so these are people that can help sort of think through at the highest level, is there sort of a business concept that might be worth exploring here. There are also resources that expand beyond that. There are many state resources that can be leveraged in that sort of initial discussion. We're then piloting an Entrepreneur in Residence program where if there is a concept that's developed, we have some resources to allocate where the faculty or students can spend some time with an individual to sort of begin to put together a little bit more of the specifics of what that business model might actually look like, how it might generate revenue or sell a product. That's a second step in the sort of process. The third was just piloted and completed actually this week. It's in partnership with the Kauffman Foundation, which is a worldwide leader in entrepreneurship. And so the Kauffman Foundation has a program called Fast Track. And Fast Track is designed as a 10-week program to take someone from the point of having a concept to having a business plan and sort of an investor pitch. And so we had 9 companies or people, individuals that went through this program and graduated this week. And it was really successful. In addition to sort of the context of the lectures that were presented, whereas we bring in experts on each of the topics, could be from human resources to finance to marketing. In addition to that, there was a real camaraderie that was developed amongst the folks that went through the program, and so that's another step in our process, which is getting more toward sort of putting some meat and bones to the business aspect. And then the next step is, as I mentioned in my introduction, I serve as the president of our incubator here in town called the Montana Technology Enterprise Center. And basically it's a 32,000 square foot facility here in Missoula, just across the river. And we have just completed a $3.5 million construction project, and that helped, one, to facilitate the expansion of Rivertop Renewables, which I talked about earlier, and secondly, it changed the business model of our incubator to more of an anchor tenant model. And in layman's terms, basically that gives us an opportunity now to focus more on programmatic assistance to the companies that are there, in terms of helping them to develop and grow their businesses so that they can graduate and move on into our community to be, again, job creators and revenue generators for our local economy. And so that serves as the next step in sort of really beginning to put the business together. And then the final stage is that there's a couple of opportunities for investment capital, specifically even here to Montana. There's a group up in the Flathead, and then locally here there's some effort to put together what are called angel investors through the Missoula Economic Partnership. And so these are mechanisms, once the idea has been developed, to then begin to look for some funding to kind of advance that idea forward. So these are some sort of the processes that we've put in place to sort of help with that entrepreneurship aspect. The other thing that I always like to mention that's really a passion of mine is student involvement. And so we have, throughout that process, a lot of interns that get involved, and a lot of that's in partnership with our School of Business, as well as our School of Law. So we have law students that help on the intellectual property side of things. We have business students that help with the business development aspect. And we recently were able to launch through funds from F-Score, sort of an entrepreneurship internship opportunity where students basically self-selected companies to work with for 50 hours of time. And our first cycle was in the spring. We funded 7 projects. And in this fall cycle, we had around 20 applicants, and only had the resources to fund 10 of those. And so, again, just from a visionary perspective, thinking about culture, the whole idea of technology transfer and entrepreneurship is one and the same. It's really about people and making connections and sharing ideas. And leveraging our skills and resources to move things forward. So in closing, the office has an open door policy. Our contact information, 243-2148 is the number here on campus. Email is joe.fanguy@umontana.edu. So feel free to drop us a line anytime. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and look forward to talking with some of you soon. Thanks.